justice is artificial. Society, we form it in a way that is pleasant and useful. And after the religious wars, you can see how this was tempting. This vision where, hey, we're going to separate our discussion of political society from religious debates and philosophical debates about the good life.
Join the best in the movement. It's Conservative Conversations with ISI, educating for liberty since 1953. Welcome back. You're listening to Conservative Conversations with Marlo, Slayback, and Tom Sarrouf.
Joining us today is Aaron Zubia, who's an assistant professor of humanities at the Hamilton Center for Classical and Civic Education at the University of Florida. And he is also the author of this book, The Political Thought of David Hume. Welcome, Aaron.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Marlo. Great to be here.
And I want to start by asking you, it's both a personal question, but it also segues into your book, which you start by situating David Hume as a main actor, an architect of modern political thought. And so my question is why Hume, this book is both carefully written, well-researched. It's clear that you've read everything he's ever written, probably most of the secondary literature that is available or relevant to your topic. So that sort of implies or insinuates that, there's a lot of care that you have in order to talk about this one person and his political thought.
Right.
So for you personally, why Hume, but also why is David Hume loom so large in the development of the modern political thought?
That's a great question. I remember when I first started reading Hume, which was in 2016 when I was a graduate student at Columbia, and I was trying to explain to my father, who David Hume was, and I looked at my shelf and saw all the Hume books, and I thought, why in the world did I choose Hume? Why didn't I choose someone whose books would take up, maybe a fourth of a shelf and not an entire shelf? He wrote a lot. He wrote a well-known treatise of human nature, which was, he had the idea for it when he was 18. He worked on it for 10 years. While he's from Scotland, he was in France and in England when he was writing the treatise of human nature, published anonymously in 1739 and 1740. That was published anonymously, and he wanted it to be a big hit. So from the very beginning, the time that he's writing, and this relates to why he's important, he wanted to revolutionize the way people thought about human affairs, about morality. He wanted to apply the experimental method to morals. He wanted to reshape how people thought. So he's in conversation with Locke, with Shaftesbury, with Hobbes, Francis Hutcheson, with Joseph Butler, the major moralists of his day, Bernard Mandeville as well. But he's unhappy that his treatise fell dead-born from the press, quoting Alexander Pope. He says it fell dead-born from the press. It didn't sell well, so he started writing popular essays, moral and political. And a volume came out in 1741, a volume in 1742. And then he's thinking, well, this is better, this short essay format. So he's ultimately a popularizer. The treatise was dense, it was long, thick. The essays, they're about moral and political topics, but they're also philosophical in nature, and they're easier to read. So he revises the treatise and comes out with his other well-known books in 1748, An Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding, in 1751, An Enquiry Concerning the Principle of Morals, which he said was his best book. And then he writes a collection of economic essays in 1752. By this time, people know who Hume is, and he's known as an essayist. Then he writes a 6-volume history of England from 1754 to 62. And he wrote a lot, and he's careful about what he wrote. He amends it. He's looking at it, making adjustments to his essays and his philosophical writings to the time of his death in 1776. And so one thing that's interesting about Hume is that he's writing at a time when the public sphere is really developing, and he's writing to the reading public, men and women in the reading public. So, I think even more so than a Hobbes or a Locke, he's reaching a broader audience and trying to apply the principles of politics, the philosophical principles of politics, to everyday occurrences. So I think he's well read, he's popular, he's thought of as, the inheritor of Montesquieu, really, in England and on the continent, like the man of letters. He's read by the founding fathers, James Madison in particular. So, I was interested in these big ideas, who helped shape the political imagination, including in this country, and David Hume was the person I looked to.
Hey there, listener. I wanted to take a quick moment to thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations. This podcast is a production of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, and our mission here at ISI is educating for liberty. If you'd like to join us in fulfilling our mission, consider helping us by rating and reviewing this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen, to help us reach more listeners like yourself. Now, back to the show.
Could you pinpoint for us the period of time that he was writing in, especially in that Scottish Enlightenment period, and kind of what the intellectual ferment looked like at that time? Because Edinburgh was kind of a hub of sorts, and he was, this was the latter half of the 18th century. So what was happening during that time that made Hume such a, was a formative figure? And also, what was his influence in the Scottish Enlightenment largely, which obviously had different kinds of thought. It wasn't just, it was, just not a solely unified movement on the American founding and some of the founding era philosophy.
Yeah, that's right. There's a lot going on in the Scottish Enlightenment, and I see it beginning really with the works of Francis Hutcheson, who was a professor at Glasgow, and he is a moral sense theorist. So on the moral philosophical level, there's debates between moral skeptics like Thomas Hobbes or Bernard Mandeville, who say, there's moral virtue and vice, they're created either by contract or by politicians. Then you have moral rationalists or realists like Samuel Clarke, who was Anglican and Newtonian, and he said, well, there are moral principles ingrained in nature and we can access them. And the Scottish moral sentimentalists, they argue that there's a universal feeling of morality. And there are, Hume is himself a moral sentimentalist. He is, as you said, an outlier in the Scottish Enlightenment to a certain extent, but he shares some common themes. So I'll tell you how he shares some of these common themes. There's a moral sense theory. There's also a developing social science, a concern with the progress of human society. This culminates in Adam Smith's 4 stages theory, where you have, the age of hunting and shepherding and agriculture in a commercial society. So there's a sort of social scientific perspective. There are certain social laws and stages through which society has progressed, and there's a sort of impartial philosophical analysis of this. Another element is a focus on the economic laws that govern society. Adam Smith was very close friends with David Hume, and in some cases, in Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, he says, my friend David Hume is the only person who's discovered this so far. And you can tell if you read the 1752 political discourses of Hume that Adam Smith has read these and is further developing these ideas. Now, there are some things in which Smith does not agree with Hume. And matter of fact, no one else in the Scottish Enlightenment really agrees with Hume, and that's Hume's critique of religion, which was a really harsh critique of religion. He was reputed to be a skeptic, an infidel, an atheist. He fell into a bog one time, and a group of women saw him and wouldn't help him out until he said the Lord's Prayer. They knew what this guy was about. He did say the Lord's Prayer, and they took him out. And Hume likes to tell this at the dinner table, this story. But this is where there's one of the ways in which Hume really departs from others in the Scottish Enlightenment, his critique of religion, which is one reason he did not get a teaching position at Edinburgh or Glasgow. There was an opening in 1745 in Edinburgh at the University of Glasgow in 1751. Hume's name was mentioned, but you had to subscribe to the Westminster Confession of Faith. You had to open class with prayer. If you don't do these things, there was a close connection in the Scottish Enlightenment between the church and the enlightened ministers and the teachers in the university. And there was a culture, an enlightened culture that was also religious, but Hume not so much. And so when Adam Smith, at the end of Hume's life, wrote that Hume most closely approached the perfectly virtuous man, people in Scotland were up in arms because they said, how can someone who's an atheist be quote unquote virtuous? But that was part of, I argue that's the main thrust of Hume's project, is separating morals from its foundation in religion. But in this way, he's not really following the Scottish Enlightenment trends. Another thing is, like Francis Hutcheson, he translated Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. That was one of the best-selling books in Scotland at the time. And there's a focus on divine providence. There's a focus on natural law, and Hume is an anti-Stoic, anti-natural law thinker. So a really interesting guy, and it's interesting that he's one of the most prominent of the Scottish Enlightenment figures.
Yeah, and on that note, as an anti-Stoic, you talk a fair bit in the book, dedicate time to how he is an inheritor of a revivified tradition of Epicureanism in this sort of period with people like Hobbes and Mandeville and Pierre Bayle.
Right.
And I'm wondering if you could explain what Epicureanism is, and both ancient and modern, what differences there might be in this sort of modern neo-Epicurean movement. And then also, if you could, because one of the other pieces of this is the skepticism by which his anti-religious teaching comes through. So if you could sort of, how does he take Epicureanism and skepticism and put them together for this large project he's after?
Right, that's excellent and important to differentiate between ancient and modern Epicureanism. To situate this question in the broader scope of the book, I'm looking at the origins of the modern political imagination, the origins of liberalism in particular, and so I see a sort of comprehensive doctrine, a set of beliefs, a set of metaphysical presuppositions that liberalism contains as a tradition, and that are really articulated by Hume. And so I mentioned part of the Scottish Enlightenment, it was characterized by a look to the Stoics, to Seneca, Marcus Aurelius, Cicero, who in many cases adopted Stoic morals. And so there was a kind of Hellenistic a concern with situating philosophical debates in their Hellenistic predecessor. So in ancient Greece, you have the main philosophical schools. You have Socrates, and you have Plato and his academy. You have Aristotle and his school, and you have the Stoics in their school, and the Epicureans in their school. And so these philosophers are debating key issues. What is virtue and what is vice? Is there an afterlife? What is the nature of things? So these philosophers are all divided among each other. But one easy way to distinguish them, I think, is Socrates and his concern with the good, the true, and the beautiful. That's continued, although there are minor differences, but that's continued with Aristotle, with Plato, and with the Stoics. The Epicureans, on the other hand, differentiated themselves from Socrates. They hated Socrates. They spit. Epicurus said, I spit on the good and the beautiful, and I hold that the final good, virtue, that which constitutes happiness, is pleasure, or more specifically, the absence of pain. So the Epicurean school is a hedonistic school. The Epicurean school is empirical in its approach to science. And I think that the ancient Epicureans as a whole were governed by two principles, which is freedom from fear of the gods and freedom from fear of death. So there was a quest for tranquility. And it was thought that, if we can free people from the belief that divine actors are involved in worldly affairs, and if we can free them from fear of an afterlife, they will be tranquil and they'll be able to tend their gardens in community. And Epicurus is well known as an ancient atomist, a belief that all things are made up of atoms in combination with each other. And so he thought in political society, that's what political society is like, a bunch of atoms coming together. And so we imitate nature by coming together and agreeing not to harm in return for not being harmed. So there's a substantive vision there. Now fast forward to the Scottish Enlightenment, and you have Hutcheson and others emphasizing Stoic principles, emphasizing mainly that there's a providential order, that morality consists in abiding by that providential order, which is accessible to humans by means of natural law, and also that there's a natural sociability. We come into groups, we form groups, married, family, villages, towns, and community. We do that naturally. Justice itself is a natural virtue. It's not something that humans created. It's something that we discover. Now Hume sides with the Epicureans, I argue, in this matter, because it was known that Hobbes and Mandeville were sort of known as modern Epicureans. If you're not a Stoic, you're an Epicurean because you're denying that humans are naturally sociable. You argue that they come into society, they create the terms of justice, and you argue also that there's no real consideration above pleasure and pain, right? So there's a kind of hedonism, there's a kind of empiricism, and you see this in Hume. We're going to test things by the way they work in experience, not what accords with our rational philosophical understanding of natural order. So these are some of the ways in which I think the Neo-Epicurean language is important. And one of the differences between ancient Epicureanism and modern Epicureanism is, the moderns, starting with Bacon, they look at nature as something to and so Hume takes that, adopts that modern stance. So the ancient Epicureans want to live in accordance with nature, and Hume is modern insofar as he wants to manipulate nature. But this fits pretty well with the Epicurean vision because of its emphasis on artifice, on man-made creation. So like justice is artificial. Society, we form it in a way that is pleasant and useful. And after the religious wars, you can see how this was tempting. This vision where, hey, we're going to separate our discussion of political society from religious debates and philosophical debates about the good life. And here we go. We have a sort of atomistic vision which accords with the new science that's developing with Robert Boyle and with Bacon. And then you have an accompanying moral and political vision that says, let's look at pleasure and utility, at usefulness, and let's not look at what's, the noble, that some transcendent good. Let's keep our eyes on earth and what's going on there. And, I argue that it's important to look at this philosophical framework because I think a lot of these modern Epicurean assumptions sort of get ingrained into liberal thought and are part of the substance, the connective tissue that frames how we even today look at the public political sphere.
So I want to make sure we have time to discuss liberalism. And this is, as far as Humean social arrangements go, I want to discuss the connection between liberalism and toleration and relativism. So how would you describe how those things came together in Hume's thought?
Yes, this is good. I think you have with Hume an early thinker focused on liberal pluralism. And the way he thinks about this, particularly competing visions of the good life and of truth, I think these are highlighted in a series of 4 essays that he wrote on the ancient philosophical sects. So Platonism, Epicureanism, Stoicism, and skepticism, which allows me to tackle some of Tom's previous question. But he looks at this and he says, well, some people say the good is in contemplation, like the Platonists. Some people say the good is in public action, like the Stoics. Some people say that the good is pleasure, like the Epicureans. And then he's, as the skeptic, which is really like the voice that he adopts, he says, well, really, it's just like a useful combination of these 3 things. I mean, interestingly, he says, this is the skeptical standpoint, but utility is that which defines the Epicurean standpoint. So that's why like skepticism and Epicureanism tend to work together, because if you're not going to ground a theory of morals in a natural law or some form of transcendence or final good that accords with human nature, that is fit with human nature, then you're going to opt for some sort of combination of pleasure and utility, which is what the Epicureans do. So a kind of, as much as Hume wants to say I'm agnostic on this matter or impartial on this matter, I think Hume shows, even though he tries to adopt like the skeptical viewpoint, and this is why so many people attacked him as an atheist, as a hedonist, is because they see, well, by claiming a kind of agnosticism, you're really taking a side. So it's, kind of superficial skepticism or agnosticism. But Hume says, look, these are all different sentiments, recurring sentiments over time. I think these are feelings. People feel that the good is contemplation. People feel that the good is in public action. People feel this, and really that's what it is, feelings, and keep feelings to the side. So you have, an attempt to situate private morals, put them on one side, and then separate a kind of public reason or public thinking, which only refers to utility and pleasure in public life. So this is pretty interesting on the level of toleration. Like, okay, so what can we tolerate? And Hume does say at one point, man, I wish for the days when, like in the old days when Epicureans and Stoics and skeptics could get together and just have nice conversations, and nobody was canceled. He didn't use that word, canceled. I guess he kind of was canceled if he wasn't canceled. He wasn't given a university appointment. I don't know if that's being canceled. But he's saying like, oh, everybody's getting up in arms about this. I wish we could just discuss peacefully. Interestingly, he doesn't mention the Platonist in speaking congenially and convivially together, because the Platonist has like a pretty firm grip on divine reason and a focus on natural law. And it's like, can that be tolerated alongside a temporal, mundane focus on pleasure and utility? I mean, it seems not. And that's one reason in the book, I argue that, when John Rawls, a modern American thinker, 20th century social contract theorist, when he says, well, each person's conception of the good is a product of sentiment or feeling, he's working on a kind of Humean basis. And in Rawls's Theory of Justice, a famous book from 1979, he even describes himself as a kind of moral sentimentalist. And so I'm trying to connect the dots here. And so your question about toleration is great, because, in his system, I mean, how much can the kind of classical Christian Platonist be tolerated? And that's one reason why Rawls says, our language of public reason, the language we use in the public square, well, it's not going to be a kind of Socratic and Platonist language. It's not going to be a Christian language. Okay, I mean, that has implications for the way we approach, public political life.
Building off of that question, especially if we're supposed to cabin off our private mores and then notions of a public good based on utility, I mean, thinkers from the Greeks, Augustine, Aquinas, Russell Kirk, argue
Yeah,
for this inherent connection between the private mores and the public good. So if
yeah,
we're going to separate those, for Hume, what is the glue that builds or binds civilization together? Because if it's my personal pleasure, like, what do I need you for? I can just read your book. I don't have to talk to you, or I can read this, or, go do all sorts of other things that aren't, intellectually high-minded. So what's the glue that wherein I need someone if we're atomistic individuals who are coming together on the basis of our own private self-interest as opposed to public concerns?
yeah. That's a great question. I mean, Hume's sort of two minds on this. I mean, he has a sort of mental breakdown when he's young, and he's trying to live up to. He reads Shaftesbury's Characteristics, which is a book of sort of neo-Stoic morals, and he thinks this is really hard. And I'm like reading these books, I'm trying to grow in knowledge and virtue, and I'm not really doing so well. And I need to write to my doctor because I I have what was called at the time the disease of the learned. Like exactly what you said. Like I'm in this world and I'm trying to live up to the standard, and it's really hard, and it doesn't seem to conform to polite society, the English commercial society that's developing. Um, and so he opts for a different understanding of human nature. But one thing that his doctor says is, what, go play, billiards with friends, go have dinner with friends, go on a walk. So Hume is sort of, he realizes the importance of physical exercises, of company, and he says solitude is one of the worst fates that could befall a person. So he uses this language that would make you say, well, this doesn't sound like an atomist. This doesn't sound like an extreme individualist. But I mean, what I argue ultimately is that Hume's system is inconsistent. He doesn't have the resources to create, or at least to model, a kind of society based on deep connection. And one of the reasons this is the case is that he denies that universal benevolence is ingrained in each human person. So for writers like Samuel Clarke, who I mentioned, and Francis Hutcheson, there's the desire for personal development, but there's also a desire for the social good, which is tied to God's providential arrangement, His universal benevolence, and there's a connection there. That's what Hutcheson calls a communicable virtue. God implants this desire for the good of all in all of us. And Hume says, that's not the case. He separates public order from this concept of benevolence, and he really looks at economics as the glue. I mean, you sort of mentioned the glue, the bond, the interconnective tissue, whereas I just read in class, the class I'm teaching here at UF, John Winthrop's The Model of Christian Charity, and he argues the bond, the interconnective tissue of the body of Christ is the same as that for the body politic. It's love, it's charity. Because if you just have justice, like a strict justice, uh, you need mercy. You need something beyond that. You need the grace of the theological virtues to really have a fulfilling society. It's not going to be vindictive and combative and retributive. Hume, meanwhile, thinks like the enlarging public sphere, and it's sort of an urban cosmopolitan vision. Where more people are getting together, reading the same books, talking to each other in polite society, in coffee houses and taverns and gardens, and we're engaging in more exchange. And this seems to be the glue of large society. So, whereas previous thinkers would think, well, love is the glue that binds us together ultimately. Hume thinks it's a kind of uh, public formed by commerce, both, I mean, a kind of material commerce, like trade of things and goods and services, but also a trade in ideas. And so he sees this as, okay, through experience and interaction, socialization, I see the commonalities between people, and so I sort of see their humanity. And this is where Hume's moral psychology plays in. But I mean, that's his vision, really. It's this get out together in public, and then you develop a kind of concern for public order.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's an economy or the construction of a commercial society that sort of informs and gives rise to notions of justice and of the common good, not in the sense of some overarching summum bonum, but the aggregation of self-interests that we can better pursue together than
Right.
separately.
Right. And then this, I mean, just to come to contemporary relevance, particularly for conservatism, I mean, if you see, Hume um, and his emphasis on the public, you have conservative readers of Hume who would say, well, that's why you protect the competitive market. That's where how you have social intercourse is peaceful, it's mutually beneficial, and like government is made to protect that. And then you have more liberal and progressive. Well, I mean, they're all liberal, right? So I would call them conservative liberals and progressive liberals. The progressive liberals would say, well, as we continue to evolve a sort of public sentimentalism, or right, a sort of moral sense in society, we're going to emphasize like the inclusion of excluded voices. We're going to emphasize, the inclusion, sort of, we can recognize that the equal respect that each person deserves. And then you see how you can have a moral sense that keeps evolving because it's detached from any eternal, immutable standard. It's going to progress. So you have Hume here, really, I think, giving us the broad outline of how we think about politics, and then you have people on the right and left, going one way, like, okay, well, this, he progress, but not too fast. Let's sort of keep the progress that we made and keep it secure here. And then you have others saying, no, I mean, we can continue to grow in knowledge. Progressives who think, well, there's a sort of never-ending trajectory of growth and development.
That's perfect, because it kind of takes us where I was gonna kind of wanted to ask with my next question, which is if Hume's conservatism is ultimately ensconced within this larger liberal modern project, so that we have a conservative liberalism or a liberal conservatism, is it possible for conservatives to have the sort of liberal approach to politics, freedom and equality for all, lowering the ends of politics to, things that can be common as opposed to the ultimate, arguing and fighting over ultimate ends, and then also have a conservative worldview, reverence for religion, family, nation, respect for the enduring moral order, a love of variety, prejudices of various kinds, things like that. So can you sort of cabin off the liberal, or can you cabin off the political goals and call those liberal while still maintaining conservatism? And if you can't, and then that you're right, that Hume is ultimately, or conservatism is appropriated as sort of Humean lens in various respects, where should conservatives go?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I think the language of liberalism, and by that I mean, when you're in the public square and you mention something, what's going to be regarded as illiberal? Well, it'll be, it's for the most part. I mean, according to like the public reason literature that is out there. I mean, public reason liberalism, political liberalism, which says like there's a particular language that we use in the public square, and any other language is illiberal. It's religious language, or even like a kind of classical Platonic or even Aristotelian language. Like there are certain capacities that humans have that they are fit for, and the development of these capacities, say procreative capacities, the desire for marriage and family, the desire for truth, including transcendent truth. Like this is not included in the kind of bucket of things you can talk about according to public reason liberalism, because the very assumption is that is not accessible to everybody. That's clearly not the perspective of the classical Christian tradition. What I would say is the Western tradition, which is a development of Greek metaphysics and Roman law and Christian theology, and built on the Jewish, Hebrew and Christian scriptures. I mean, the idea there is there's an accessible truth, there's an accessible natural law that is universal and objective, and so that is highly accessible. It's written in the hearts, and it is, that by prohibiting that, by precluding that very kind of thinking, I think the liberal framework is hostile to Christianity and to a kind of classical, whether Platonic or Aristotelian morals. So what do we do at that point? That is a great question. I mean, I think break out of that framework as best as we can, but that doesn't mean denying freedom and equality when I think those principles derive from that very Western tradition, the classical Christian tradition that contemporary liberalism rejects. And there's always been a differentiation in tasks or duties. I mean, like justice, commercial exchange. This is part of terrestrial life, political life, social life. And there is such a thing as revelation, and it's not, it's beyond reason, but it's not hostile to reason. And one thing about the Epicurean tradition is, along with it, is this separation of faith and reason. So, if it's not part of the empirical method, then it's an irrational leap of faith. And so that sundering of faith and reason, I think, is really what we see developed by the modern Epicureans and being really cemented into the liberal vision. And any kind of recovery of that, that complementarity of faith and reason, I think will be beneficial, because I think it's untrue to human life to block out the transcendent element, and I think that's the blocking out of that transcendent element is part of why we have such a chaotic and malformed public.
So unfortunately, we are running out of time, but I'm glad you addressed that. And I think, I'd love to, I think during this conversation, we've been able to highlight these different aspects of Hume's thought and his place in the story of modern political thought. And your book as well does that. So for any readers interested, that book will be linked in the notes of the podcast episode when you see it. But if someone's listening to this episode today and is interested in perhaps reading Hume himself, where would you suggest that they start?
Good question. If you want, I think Hume in the most digestible format, go to the 1751 Enquiry Concerning the Principles of Morals. That's a great place to start.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Aaron. This was a pleasure.
Yes, I enjoyed it very much. Thank you all for having me.
Thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations with ISI. If you've enjoyed this episode, be sure to check out our website at isi.org/resources to see all that we offer our members, including the Intercollegiate Review, select modern age articles, debates, lectures, and of course, this podcast. Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to rate and review, and we will see you next time on Conservative Conversations with ISI.